Welcome to the podcast of All Means All. In this episode, Chloë Keegan, Hermione Miao, Cynthy Haihambo, and Victor Tan Chee Shien will talk about social space orientation and inclusion.
So what we mean by social space, it's the areas where people have opportunities to create social environments for learning and being together and having fun. But it's regardless of the physical location and the physical design of a space. So, for example, you may have a building that has physical attributes or physical designs like ramps and railings, but you may have people that still feel excluded or isolated in that physical environment. So we're really emphasising that in a social space, it's the shared meaning, it's the social purpose that really makes that social dynamic quite meaningful for the people, and that eliminates or mitigates against exclusion and isolation in the space. But then we also looked at social space and how inclusive it becomes is very much based on how valued and how respected people feel in the space. And that also helps to mitigate against that isolation because people feel that they're being heard by others, and they're also listening to others as well in that dynamic. So we're very much emphasising that the social actors in a space, they really influence that inclusive part, because without that social dynamic, that physical space can be deemed as being exclusive more than inclusive. So we're going beyond the physical build of locations and emphasising that it's the social dynamics between social actors that influences how inclusive a space is.
Yeah, like for example, if we talk about international students, we talk about the social space could be in person, hybrid, online, or very much combined across different time space. Like before they travel to their university they're going to study, they may already have some online social space that they get to know each other. And when they go there, they not only have their PhD kind of social space, they can talk to people around the campus, around the neighborhood. They may have other social space more developed. And what if happen like during COVID, they may have it online and all different kind of hybrid things. We want to talk about the social space in different kind of format, not limited to the physical space.
So in continuing with what Chloë and Hermione said earlier, we are bringing this discussion closer to teacher education students and to teachers. And in this chapter, we describe social space as physical, psychological, and virtual environments in which people can thrive and experience a sense of belongingness and respect. And we also do know that working in this social space or operating within a social space creates that sense of belongingness, right? And such environments should be friendly, usable to everyone. And I want to pose a question to you. Have you ever been in an environment where you felt that you were not really included and that you did not really belong? Let's say, for example, in a classroom or at a music festival, in a restaurant where, for example, nobody spoke your language and nobody made an effort to try and communicate to you. How did this situation make you feel? And going back to teachers, we do not want children in our care to feel this way. Neither do we want anyone in our environment, whether they are children, they are young people, or more adult people. We don't want them to feel excluded that way. So we should create social spaces where everyone can feel welcome. Why is this important? We know that when people are made to feel unwelcome and uneasy, it has an impact on their mental well-being. And if they experience these negative environments, they really feel that they are not worth, and therefore we need to try and increase safe spaces, inclusive spaces, so that it enables people to build their resilience. And the opposite is that if we do not provide those kind of spaces, then people feel excluded and they cannot thrive either educationally, socially, or beyond.
I think it's important to for beginning teachers to learn about social space, because you can still be excluded in an inclusive space. Making a space physically accessible doesn't increase its inclusivity, because without that purposeful engagement, you're not really engaging, whether it's the learning individual or whether it's recognizing your own role in that social space. People engage with different life stages as they develop. As a child, the main environment that you engage with is the school, and as you grow up, this environment starts to get more complex. You'll be meeting you'll be engaging with different social spaces such as employment spaces, digital spaces like what Hermione mentioned. You'll be going into more complex spaces, and if you don't understand yourself and if you don't understand the space that you interact with, sometimes it's difficult in that sense to actually establish yourself and know your surroundings and your learners. So I think it's important for beginning teachers to be aware of not just the needs of the learners, but to be aware of that you yourself are an actor in that social space. Because it's not about where the child sits or whom the child should partner with. Learning or the design of learning should be purposeful, because if the child is not engaged in that activity, we're just not being inclusive in that context.
Yeah, it's kind of like, if I bring a bit of more comment on this, is not just even with children, I would say even when you're adult, like for me, traveling from my home country to a different country with completely cultural context and all of this, how do I notice this is not just an academic transition I need to go through, this intercultural dimension, how I go through. Like when I go there, the tradition like in UK, they go to pub and socialize, and we don't have that in China. Like, how do I kind of like understand the different social space, the different kind of like social norms? These are the things kind of quite hidden in the education I've been going through. Like, I know how to perform academically, but I don't know how to make new friends in a new social context, and where I feel included by the society just by having good score or have terrible score. No, I need to see myself as a human being, or different kind of needs being seen, and knows how to navigate the system. I think that's what we were talking about with the social space orientation and inclusion, to be aware of each other as human beings. They have basic needs and their welfare.
Yeah, continuing with that conversation, we all know that human beings are social beings, right? Everybody wants to relate to someone. And like Hermione said, if you just move from another country, from one country to another, you're used to a different culture. So you need to form or to be part of a social space that is inclusive, that understands that where you come from, people don't go to clubs, and someone needs to invite you so that you can join and understand what is happening in that particular space. So human beings thrive in environments that empower them, so that they can interact with others and interact with the environments, and they experience respect and belongingness. So teachers have a responsibility to co-create these environments. It is not good enough to tell children or young people, old people, oh, there's a park there, you can go sit there. We are interested in our chapter in bringing forward the idea of co-creation. How can young people, children, all individuals be invited in creating this space? How can they contribute to the way they want their space to be? And I want to give you an example of a learner that moves from one school to another. This is something that specifically teacher education students and teachers need to consider. if a child moves from grade 7 and they go to a different school for grade 8, their life can be disrupted because now they might need to take a different bus, they might need to walk with different children. If they were used to going to the grandmother's house that was close to the old school, this is no longer there. And we as teachers need to make sure that we make this transition smooth, not only in the environment where the child used to be, but also in the next environment where they are going to. By, for example, talking to the teachers at the new school, introducing the child to them, maybe by finding another child that goes to that school and pair them with this child so that the transition is not terrible for them and they do not experience issues such as depression and anxiety, etc.
I think it just recall me of when you say like the park, this is not enough. Like when I was first time in London, I do enjoy when people say like, let's walk in the park. So I'm like, oh, actually I don't have to kind of like go there by myself and don't know how to navigate it. Like people are like, why don't we go for a walk? Why don't we go for a run? Or like, oh, there's a running society you may be interested, I'm involved in. So it's kind of more inviting, I think, when some people, they are already more familiar with the social space, have someone new to go through this. And this will be passed on. Like I would do the same for people when I moved to Stirling. I see like there are people that actually want to socialize, but they like, can I say that or not? Like, of course you can, because I had the experience being introduced and being invited to new social spaces, and I'm like, yes, this is what we can do. We can make the social space more inclusive and more welcoming.
I think the social group that the person is going into, I think it's important to prepare that also. As in, when beginning teachers are receiving students, they can look at the dynamics of the class that they already have, and the new student coming in, what can they do? How can they make that environment inviting in that context?
And this includes virtual environments too. We know that people nowadays are on WhatsApp, on Twitter, and so on, and they need to be included in those spaces as well, right?
Yes, so it's also what we cover in our chapter as well, is the idea that a social space, as Hermione and Cynthy had mentioned, is these familiar spaces, and a familiar space also doesn't exactly equal inclusion either, where we have an example of a 4-year-old preschooler who was very much in their familiar environments, but what they experience is a lot of isolation and exclusion from the fact that they aren't being heard or listened to. So we were really emphasising within that social space that it's not a case of it's an unfamiliar or a familiar environment, that inclusion and exclusion can happen in both, but it is very much reliant on the social dynamics between those groups and how that's impacted then.
So that's the thread through our chapter, that we are building it around case studies, and also the key message that we want to communicate to the teachers is that we do know that teachers are agents of change, and we want them to think out of the box and co-develop good environments in their schools, and also extending their role to the communities, so that, and in creating these environments, they can not only create an environment and live there, they should also help children navigate this environment and practice humanity and compassion in these multidimensional spaces. So teachers should be able to take on that agency of creating change. If they have to negotiate around the policies, they should do so in order to provide this social inclusive spaces.
Yeah. And chipping with one point about this, like, with my PhD, a lot about teacher agents, and this, when I talk about this, I always think about like, but who are they before they become teachers? Like, and their initial teacher education and their past experience, have ever they been invited and been nurtured in an inclusive space? Like, for example, we see international students. What about the part-time students who are doing a job and so that they could stay in university. But it's not the case here maybe, but in UK it exists. Like they sometimes feel like they can never come to campus because they are working full time. And when they have time, it's evening. So like when I was organizing the community of early career researchers, we do something online and we even record podcasts so that they could come whenever they want to. They could even say like, oh, I want you to talk about this exact time. We will talk about it. So this created a social space. Doesn't have like this exact time, but everyone could come there and they know there being someone leaving the message to them, just like what we are doing today.
Mm-hmm. And that's why it's very important that in our social space chapter, as we're discussing, is we're looking to identify the lifespan, because we're identifying that, you know, people when they're very young have certain spaces that they engage in, and then over the course of a lifespan they engage in different social spaces. For example, if it is a school or university, but then what social spaces do people have engagement in when they're older? So for example, senior citizens and how that changes, or maybe slightly different to say a younger preschooler, for example. So that's what we look to capture, is because social space is quite diverse in, like you said, experiences and the history that you're bringing, but also being aware of that in other people, so that you can recognize what the social spaces they've engaged in, but also potentially then where yourself and others come together in future or in present in that social space.
What you can expect from this chapter, I think from my part and discussing with my colleagues, is that there are 2 points I want to make sure the message comes through. The first is about the ecological view of teacher agency. And when we were designing this kind of like chapter, we were thinking about a plant from seedling process to grow into trees and become part of the ecosystem. There will be animals coming along, there will be other plants growing. The ecological view of teacher agency and is based on the ecological view of human agency in the life course. To see this like it's seeing agency as a saturated achievement rather than a capacity. So it's not about tick the box and evaluate people like, oh, they're good at this, they're not good at this. About thinking like, why? Like, what have made them to become this agentic person, have achieved so much agency? What have limited them, constrained them? Help them remove that constraints. So ecological view of it, I think it's about seeing individual and the interaction with the structure. That's what I mean by ecological view of agency. And the second one we talk about in this is the space making and the digital space. The space making process is about seeing like the space is not given, the social space. Some of them are there, some of them can be in the making. So people as agents of change, they could make the space more oriented towards inclusion. And for example, like what I've been doing with early career researchers community, we try to say, everyone you identify as this, or you just want a bit curious about this, come along. It's open, it's free for everyone. And intentionally try to widening the participation, but also understand sometimes this digital space or even like physical space, if you feel too overwhelming, I think this is the part where the negative side of the agency, the negative agency, we call it, you could say no. You could say like, let me give a pause, I'll come back to this later. It does not mean like agency, like keep making. Sometimes it should be like, yes, it's enough at the moment, I'll come back to this later. So it's agency, I think it's you in this, seeing yourself as agent of change. Sometimes it's a resist the change being imposed to you. Sometimes it's you actively make something.
Yeah, I think the point that I missed out just now was on the forced inclusion. Because when you force it, you meet resistance in that people don't want. Sometimes people just want their own space. As in, inclusiveness is not about you stepping over somebody or you overpowering somebody to take over that space. It's about being comfortable in a space where yourself is comfortable, the other people are comfortable.
Like bringing together the key themes that we have in this chapter between the agency, the participation, and the recognition of power. We wanted to use an example case to start off our chapter, which bridges the early childhood age groups with senior citizens and seeing what happens when they're put into a social space together. So we refer to this project in our chapter, and we're using that because we're trying to highlight that you can bring very diverse groups into one space, and it doesn't matter where that physical space is, because in our case study it was conducted in a nursing home, but it could have been in a community park, it could have been in a school, it could have been out anywhere. So it's just highlighting that the benefits and the social dynamics occurred because of the people involved, not because of the physical structure. So that's how we approached this chapter, that we were looking to extend then from that key example, the intergenerational case, and we wanted to bring it in to capture more experiences that may not be exactly in that example. So say we cover contexts that cover Ireland, Malaysia, East Africa, and then the international PhD researchers as they're coming across different countries and accessing a home country and a potentially new country. So we wanted to make sure that these case studies were relatable, but we're not expecting readers to always see themselves in these characters that we've presented. We're just using them in a way to generate more reflective thinking so that they can become aware of their own social space. Potentially when I read about, say, Ireland or East Africa, these examples, I mightn't necessarily recognize myself in these people, but I may be stimulated in, okay, but where have I come from in my social spaces, and where would I potentially feel more included and why, and maybe factoring in like the digital spaces as well, potentially to do with age or my own experience and access to technology. So that's why we felt that this chapter was very important in making sure that it was reflective in nature, because we don't have enough words to capture all the types of social spaces, but we also wanted to respect and acknowledge the individual reader's positioning when they look at social space, because it's very much their own agency and what they're bringing to that space themselves.
Yeah. And I just want to add on to this, when we talk about the potential readers and the potential people who are watching this, sometimes maybe look around. You may be not the only person who's doing this. If you're in your initial teacher education course, maybe your colleagues or your classmates, they are doing this as well. Or if you are doing this, have a chat with your friend who may also find it interesting. Talk to a teacher, talk to someone in the community. If they find this like, oh, we want to do this together. Sometimes you will know it's important about the agency and individual, but I think there's also something like a collective agency and collegiality that help you to achieve more. In the biggest finding of my PhD study is access to diverse networks. It's not just about yourself, it's about where you could look for help, where you could look for support to make it better. It's not just you want to make it more inclusive. We all want it to. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you for listening to the podcast of All Means All. In the show notes, there is a link to the chapter in the open textbook. There you can find the transcript of the video and more information on the topic.